Welcome to this joint online public meeting called by the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, or IYSSE, and the Committee for Public Education, the CFPE, both established by the Socialist Equality Party. My name is Mike Head, and I'll chair today's meeting. I'm a member of the CFPE and the National Committee of the SEP, and a correspondent for the World Socialist website. I'm also an academic at Western Sydney University. Today's meeting is titled, Oppose All the Job Cuts at Macquarie University and nationally. Build rank and file committees to defend public education. Again, we do encourage discussion and participation. We have big issues to consider. Send us comments or questions or ask to speak via the chat function. Now, we initially called this meeting in response to the campaign launched by students at Macquarie University, members of the Mathematics Society, to fight the retrenchment of one of their most appreciated maths lecturers, Dr. Frank Valkenbauer. Very quickly, the student-led petition to defend Valkenbauer received the support of more than 500 students and staff. At the same time, the announcement of our public meeting and the coverage of the campaign on the World Socialist website won wider support. That included an overwhelming vote by a meeting of about 450 staff members at the University of Sydney last week for a resolution of support moved by a CFP member at that university. In an obvious move to head off the broader fight triggered by the sacking of Valkenbauer, the Macquarie University management suddenly told him on Thursday, just 2 days before our meeting today, that it had found a new post for him as a teacher of both maths and statistics, apparently because another academic had decided to resign. Now, even if this offer is confirmed in writing, which it has not yet, this still allows the overall cuts to the mathematics department, as well as throughout the university and nationally, to go ahead. The powerful response to the campaign, which appears to have secured a job for Valkenbauer, at least for now, must be taken forward. Frank Valkenbauer is just one of a growing number of victims of job cuts, including by brutal so-called spill and fill exercises. Now, similar student-led or student-supported petitions have been initiated at Monash University and the University of Western Australia, as we've reported on the World Socialist website. The UWA Western Australian University petition is against the decimation of the School of Social Sciences, including the almost complete scrapping of sociology and anthropology. Let me read just one of the many outraged and thoughtful comments we have reported in our article on the petition. It states, quote, "Universities should represent the greatest depth of curiosity and desire to understand the nature of human existence. These cuts highlight a focus on supporting disciplines which make money at the expense of those that ask questions." Now, we regard these initiatives by students as a significant stand against the historic and ongoing government management offensive against university workers and students, which has already seen the destruction of an estimated 90,000 jobs during 2020, counting the laid-off casuals, and over 2,100 courses and 160 programs. The intervention of students is also a breakthrough against the role of the university trade unions and student associations, which have opposed any unified struggle against this assault. Instead, the unions have worked to suppress resistance and impose the cost-cutting and corporate-driven restructuring of public education. The burning question that we will seek to answer at this public meeting is, what political perspective is needed to fight this historic assault? The worsening global COVID-19 pandemic is being used to accelerate the corporate restructuring of society as a whole in the interests of the wealthy elite. Workers face pay cuts, declining conditions, and starvation level assistance packages if they're thrown out of a job by the pandemic, which many are. At the same time, the Liberal National Coalition and Labor governments alike, with the support of the unions, have handed more than $400 billion to big business and the banks during the pandemic so far. The wealth of the super rich has soared to staggering heights in Australia, as it has internationally. This offensive includes the acceleration of the transformation of the public universities in Australia and internationally into business-dominated institutions. Students cherish lecturers like Frank Falkenborough and value the higher education that they embody. But the university employers only want staff who can carry out research and courses that generate revenue from business linkages. Across Macquarie University as a whole, and in departments at other universities too, including Sydney, Queensland and UWA, university workers are being subjected to brutal Hunger Games style processes, forcing them to compete with each other for smaller numbers of jobs. The defence of not just Frank, but all university workers is bound up with, and in fact depends upon, us broadening this campaign to fight this entire underlying agenda. University staff have shown repeatedly they want to defend jobs and conditions, but we must issue a warning. If the issue is left in the hands of the National Tertiary Education Union, university workers and students will be betrayed. The NTU will do everything it can to help university managements meet their job destruction targets, one way or another. That is what has just happened at the University of Queensland's Architecture Department, where the union claimed a victory after convincing 5 academics to quit their jobs, instead of 2 positions being eliminated in a spill and fill regime. As we reported on the World Socialist website, the NTU said this was a resounding success, quote, after dragging its members through the dead ends of internal review and the Fair Work Commission. Our 2 speakers today are Zach Diot, who is the president of the IYSSC Club at Western Sydney University, and Chris Gordon, who is a member of the CFPE and a mathematics lecturer at Macquarie University. After the 2 presentations, we will open up the meeting with plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussion, which we warmly welcome and encourage. The discussion at this meeting is crucial to develop the perspective and initiatives necessary to fight the onslaught on educators, students, and the entire working class. Let me briefly place this fight in its historical and global context. For the past 4 decades, the struggles of workers in this country and internationally have been systematically suppressed by the trade union apparatuses, which now function as industrial police forces on behalf of the corporate ruling class. But a new period of revolutionary convulsions has begun, epitomised by the Volvo truck workers in Virginia in the US voting 3 times to reject a sellout contract that was being foisted on them by the United Auto Workers Union and the company. This defiance, led by a rank and file committee, working with our assistance, signals a new sentiment of rebellion against the ruling elite and its privileged union lackeys, even if the UAW union was able to concoct a return to work vote this week. This shift in the class struggle globally also reflects a growing class movement of the working class against the catastrophe unleashed on the world's population by the ruling elite's refusal to take the measures necessary to protect people from the coronavirus, creating the conditions for more infectious and deadly mutants like Delta to proliferate. As a result, more than 4 million people have died unnecessarily, and nearly 190 million have been infected, according to the officially recorded cases, with the true tolls perhaps double those. Now we see horrific scenes again of mass deaths and overcrowded hospitals in Indonesia, South Africa, Fiji, and many other parts of the globe, and resurgences in the major imperialist centres of the UK and the US. And the disaster in Sydney shows how quickly the profit-driven reopening of the economy by governments can allow the pandemic to spiral out of control. The blatant refusal of the New South Wales government to lock down fast and hard enough, backed by the Morrison government and supported by the New South Wales Labor opposition, all at the behest of big business, has allowed the Delta variant to start to spread across the country. The international working class is the only social force that can halt this worldwide calamity by taking the political and economic power out of the hands of the capitalist class and reorganising society worldwide on a socialist basis in the interest of all, not the super rich. To help develop that fight, we are calling for the formation of a network of joint rank and file committees of university workers and students, totally independent of the unions, as part of the development of an international workers' alliance of rank and file committees. The first speaker today is Zach Diot, a Western Sydney University student and president of the IYSSC club at that university. He will speak on the significance and political implications of the fight that students have taken up. This is his first time speaking at a public meeting, so please give him a warm welcome in the chat. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for coming today. In particular, I'd like to thank Frank Valkenborg, who himself is here today. And so I would like to point out the significance of this opposition to the sacking of Frank. This is the first time in quite a long time where students have independently spearheaded opposition to the sacking of a teacher. It's an expression of the deepening hostility among students to the accumulation of these attacks on the social rights of the working class, of which education is a vital part. The struggle here at Macquarie University follows the strikes by NYU and Columbia University students in New York, as well as massive protests across France last year, where tear gas using police were brought down on high schoolers by the Macron government, as well as strikes at the universities and colleges in the UK last month, and also protests over attacks on staff jobs at universities in New Zealand. Students like myself and those who have turned to the IYSSC are tired of education being turned into a privilege for the affluent layers of society, to the increase of course costs, the continuing inaccessibility to quality education in low economic areas, as well as the restructuring of curriculums to better suit the interests of big business and the government. This is our future at stake. Education is a right whose struggle the students here at Macquarie have joined. Many of the comments by students on the petition at Macquarie voiced passionate and angry opposition to the vandalization of higher education. One student wrote, "Universities should be places of learning, not money-making institutions. And in order to have quality education, we need quality teachers, like Frank." Similar deeply felt sentiments can be seen in the comments on the petitions at Monash and the University of Western Australia. The future of an entire generation is at stake. In Australia alone, there are about 1.5 million tertiary students. They have to turn to the working class as the only social force that can overturn this assault as part of the struggle against capitalism itself. Students must realize what they are fighting. In the fight for education, we're up against multi-billion-dollar universities, the corporate elite, and the governments which carry out these attacks, as well as the trade unions and student unions, which help pass these cuts by stifling opposition. Throughout the pandemic and the onslaught on university jobs and conditions, we have not heard a word from the National Union of Students, which is controlled by the Labor Party. As for the official student associations, their role was typified at the University of Newcastle, where they actually hosted a forum for the Vice-Chancellor to try to justify the cuts to students. All these organizations are tied to the capitalist profit system, and make no mistake, the capitalist system is the enemy of humanity. Because of its scores of lives have been lost in wars. I, as well as many people here today, have not lived in a period where there has not been war. Wages have not matched inflation for a long time. Unending starvation has been felt throughout the world, and the list goes on. We also confront a climate disaster, and all these threats are being intensified by the worsening global COVID-19 disaster. This is not simply a problem of individual leaders. The parallels between leaderships in virtually every country across the globe, greedily helping maximize corporate profits while leaving the remainder of its populace to fend for themselves in the midst of a pandemic are enough to demonstrate that. It is the system itself within which these representatives of the bourgeoisie operate that is corrupt and must be changed. History has shown that the development of social disasters such as war, mass job cuts, starvation, climate change, and out of control virus and so on are beyond the whims of political leaders within the capitalist system. It is not by voting in Bernie Sanders or the Greens or any other organization which claims to be the answer to our crises without distinguishing why they continue to occur that these problems can be resolved. Neither Frank nor the next generation of educators or students nor anybody else can be saved without tackling the main agenda. Change can only occur by understanding what objective processes enable such things to occur again and again so that they may be vanquished. Courses and jobs will continue to be slashed at the universities for years and years to come unless you join the revolutionary struggle and turn to the working class, not the trade unions, not the various bourgeois political parties, but the social force behind all of society's production, which unified will move mountains. We are fighting to build upon the international student movements of which this campaign at Macquarie is a part of and expand it. The fight for education can only be won by linking it to the fight against climate change, war, fascism, job cuts, and social inequality. This can only be done through a socialist program, but it is important to first identify who actually represents the fight for socialism. It's not groups such as Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance, and Solidarity. These organizations, which we rightly denounce as the pseudo-left, stem from particular layers of the upper middle classes. They are a class tendency opposed to socialism. They seek to deflect students' and workers' oppositions to capitalism away from revolutionary politics and back into safe areas. When strikes have broken out in factories or protests have begun on campuses, these organizations have told the workers and students to trust the unions, who subsequently sold out their struggles. This was the case at the Coles warehouse picket in Smeaton Grange, at Sydney University after job cuts, the Woolworths factory strike in Wyong, the General Mills strike in Rooty Hill, and countless others. Their politics do not flow from the objective interests of the working class, but from a privileged group trying to push forward its own interests within the capitalist system. These tendencies will label governments as, quote, evil or corrupt, while intentionally ignoring the purpose of governments under capitalism, which is to represent the interests of their nation's ruling elites. Just as the Morrison administration does, so another Greens-backed Labor Party government would. The numerous issues facing the international working class are rooted in capitalism. Only through a Marxist method of analysis can this be understood, and only through the revolutionary parties of the International Committee of the Fourth International can one comprehend it. The struggles of the working class have historically often been triggered by students, but the student movements will be strangled without a genuine socialist perspective. The IYSSE in Australia and internationally, as the youth movement of the socialist equality parties, is committed to clarifying, developing, and giving a lead to the struggles of youth and students now erupting around the globe. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Our second speaker today is Chris Gordon. Chris is a long-standing member of the CFPE and the Socialist Equality Party. He's a mathematics lecturer at Macquarie University. He's a well-known member of our movement, having stood for the SEP in the federal elections in 2007. Please also give Chris a very warm welcome in the chat. Over to you, Chris.
Welcome. We called this public meeting to clarify the political issues raised by the emergence of significant student opposition to the cuts ravaging the universities across the country. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, educators and students have been targeted for some of the deepest attacks on jobs and conditions as well as the ruling elite exploit the still worsening global disaster to further attack the conditions of workers and young people throughout every industry. After 18 months of the deepest cuts ever seen in universities, an estimated 90,000 jobs, the opposition, led by students, has begun to break through the stifling resistance by the staff and student unions. As Mike and Zach have outlined, math students at Macquarie, arts students at Monash, social science students at the University of Western Australia have signed petitions and made comments denouncing the sacking of beloved academics and the closure of courses. At Macquarie, where I teach, the management suddenly offered a new job to Frank Valkenborough 2 days ago in an effort to head off the broad support won by the students and our movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, and the Committee for Public Education for his reinstatement. But this fight must now be taken forward. In the maths department and throughout Macquarie, the overall job cuts and restructuring continue, on top of over 300 jobs being lost since the start of last year, and this is part of a broader offensive by the government and the corporate elite. Just this week, further massive cuts were unveiled at La Trobe in Melbourne, Adelaide, and the University of Western Australia, where anthropology and sociology are being dissolved. This is an international process. In the UK, for example, there are massive cuts in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, which have been described by the Tory government as quote unquote dead-end courses. The academics being targeted are the dedicated educators like Frank. It's part of the universities tying themselves more closely to the narrow vocational and research requirements of big business. The pandemic is being used as a pretext for an entire pro-corporate restructuring of class relations in education and throughout the working class. And as in every other industry, this offensive has been assisted and enforced by the trade unions. At Macquarie, for example, despite widespread disgust at the cuts and the sacking of tenured staff in an unprecedented Hunger Games style spill and fill, the NTU did not call a single meeting to oppose the cuts. Rather, the NTU held departmental meetings in which it was said that fighting the cuts was out of the question. One university-wide meeting was suddenly held last Thursday, just two days ago. The resolution moved by the NTU at that meeting just noted the latest forced redundancies and called for more information to be given to those made redundant regarding their appeal rights. Now, since the cuts were first announced months ago, the only so-called service that the NTU has offered is for individual staff members to review the process by which their redundancy was determined. This is not a fight, but a guarantee that the cuts can proceed. At the University of Queensland, the NTU actually encouraged 5 so-called voluntary redundancies in architecture, claiming this as a resounding success. The original management proposal was to cut 2 staff in a spill and fill operation. So the NTU has worked with management to achieve cost-cutting measures and then some. The collaboration between the unions and management was on display throughout 2020 as the pandemic hit. With the collapse in international student numbers, an existing crisis created by decades of funding cuts by successive Liberal, National and Greens-backed Labor governments was exacerbated. The NTU went to university managements behind the backs of university workers, offering wage cuts of up to 15%, supposedly as a job protection scheme, while still accepting that there would be thousands of job cuts, many thousands of job cuts. This behind the backs maneuver created a revolt amongst university workers, and most university managements pulled out of this national deal, concerned that the NTU would not be able to enforce it against its own members. But the union went ahead anyway and struck similar deals with individual managements. At the small number of universities that imposed the so-called jobs protection framework, there have been massive job losses and forced redundancies, including those just announced at La Trobe and at Adelaide. the alignment with corporate interest is not peculiar to the NTU. It's characteristic of all the trade unions. Sally McManus, the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, ACTU, pledged that the unions would give employers, quote, everything you want in response to the pandemic. Christian Porter, who was then Minister for Industrial Relations, referred to McManus as his BFF, his best friend forever. Now, this was not an aberration. The unions have functioned as industrial policemen for decades, especially since the accords with the Hawke and Keating Labor governments in the 1980s and 1990s, and the reinforcement of enterprise bargaining and the anti-strike laws under the Rudd and Gillard Labor governments from 2007 to 2013. Unions once sought concessions from employers, always within the framework of wage labour and national capitalist economies, but that role has been shattered by the globalisation of production, which has transformed them into apparatuses for extracting conditions back from workers in order to make their employers globally competitive. The Fair Work laws, which made industrial action illegal outside of outside of the formal bargaining periods, were imposed under the Rudd-Gillard Labor governments in 2009. The NTU and other union leaders claim that workers cannot fight because they confront some of the most draconian laws in the world. But the unions helped draft these laws precisely to reinforce their role in straitjacketing workers. Labor was also at the forefront of the commercialisation of tertiary education, initiated by the Hawke government's reintroduction of fees for both domestic and international student fees in the 1980s. Then came the Rudd-Gillard 2008 so-called education revolution, which forced universities to fight each other for enrolments, particularly from full fee paying international students, and then cutting tertiary funding by $2.7 billion in 2013. Labor's market-driven education revolution was backed by the Greens, which kept the Gillard government in office. The education revolution was endorsed and policed by the NTU, underlining their own commitments to meeting the strategic, vocational, and profit-making demands of the Australian corporate elite. They insisted that the Australian universities be made, in their words, internationally competitive. As Zach has said, various pseudo-left groups that sometimes falsely claim to represent socialism are trying to shore up the unions after the naked betrayals of 2020. They represent upper middle class layers that are just as hostile as the union bureaucrats to the eruption of working class struggles. University workers and students are posed with a struggle not just against governments and university management, but against the unions and the Labor Party. A new political perspective is needed, with new organisations completely independent from the unions. A counteroffensive of the working class requires the formation of genuine organisations of struggle, a network of rank and file committees that are controlled by and answerable to the workers, linking workers across the education sector and the working class as a whole, nationally and internationally. In April, our World Party, the International Committee of the Fourth International, called for the formation of an international workers' alliance of rank and file committees. And we wrote at the time, the working class is ready to fight, but it is shackled by reactionary bureaucratic organisations that suppress every expression of resistance. End of quote. It is essential to initiate a nationwide unified fight against the assault on jobs and conditions, and link up with students, educators, and all workers internationally who are facing similar critical struggles against the impact of the worsening global crisis. The crisis in education is one expression of the social regression being caused by the capitalist system, a system that is incompatible with meeting the social needs of the working class as a whole. A mass political movement of the working class must be developed that will take matters into its own hands and launch an offensive against the capitalist system itself. The social right of all to a free public education, along with healthcare, decent jobs, housing, and access to culture, requires the socialist reorganisation of society in the interest of the majority, not a handful of wealthy parasites. The banks and major corporations must be expropriated and transformed into publicly owned utilities under the democratic control of the working class, so that the wealth it produces is used to satisfy the social needs and rights for all. So in conclusion, we urge everyone here to take up this fight by joining the IYSSE and the CFPE and our party, the Socialist Equality Party. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. So we're now opening up for any questions, comments, or requests to speak at the in the discussion, and we certainly encourage that. Said at the beginning, we have huge historic issues to resolve. We're all living through completely unprecedented conditions, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the assault on all the basic social conditions of the working class. And it's no accident, we don't think, that educators and students, a whole generation of young people, are among those who are being targeted the most. Now, I've seen a few interesting comments in the chat already. I'll quote a few in a minute, but I will, and also in the chat, we've already had posted numbers of links to articles from the World Socialist website. So there's plenty of material there to read further on the issues that we're raising at this meeting. I will, as we go along, refer you to some displays of further literature that you can read from our international movement. We will, towards the end, take up a collection for the fund for our movement, so we can continue and deepen our work throughout the working class. And we'll also encourage you to join, and we'll show you how you can join the IYSSE, the CFPE, and the SEP. But let's open up now for, I'll just read a couple of comments that I can see in the chat, and I'll need the help of the tech team to bring to our attention other questions that are appearing. There's a comment from James Adler. The NTU told the University of Newcastle staff not to even discuss the job cuts via email or private Facebook comments. That's typical. A comment from Cobra. The arts and humanities have always been an easy target because it doesn't serve the interests of the capitalists. I think that's true. A comment from Brenton, responding to a comment from Jenny. They also launder their money through philanthropy, etc., to lower tax obligations or make themselves appear to be the virtuous rich. And Jenny had said the ruling class is only interested in the arts if they can make money from it or for investments. I think this is true. Frank Valkenbauer has posted a comment explaining his sudden offer of a job, saying, helped perhaps a bit by the decision of one of our colleagues who decided to move back to Italy. I understand this colleague is so disgusted by the situation now in the universities that he decided to quit. Okay, let's, I think we have some questions now coming in. There's a question here from Erica. Can you say a bit more about the responses of students and academics in the US and UK, please? There's just to go back to another comment from Melissa, although it only appears to panelists on the, so you can't all see it, but Melissa said it's not on, yet the fees are still being accepted willingly and eagerly. That's to the point that the universities have become ever more dependent on student fee revenue, especially milking international students. I've noticed a few comments in the chat are still being addressed only to panelists. So please, if you want your comments to be seen by all, send them to panelists and attendees. All right, any more questions coming in before we take the first question? Feel free, please, to ask any questions, make any comments, or ask to speak. Erica has asked the question. I said, can you say a bit more about the responses of students and academics in the US and UK, please? I think Zach referred to this earlier on. I can just kick it off with a couple of comments. We've covered on our the World Socialist website quite extensively the efforts of postgraduate students who are used as cheap labor in US universities, such as at NYU in New York and also Columbia University and other institutions, against the shocking pay and conditions that they are working under. And again, they've come up very bluntly against the efforts of the union apparatuses to shut this down. And there's been many struggles in the UK as well. So other members of the panel want to come in here. Maybe Zach, you want to make some comments on this? Or
yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the situation in America is quite appalling. About 650,000 educators, significant percentage of the workforce lost their jobs last year. And then there was, I mean, the criminal reopening of schools, which produced massive protests from teachers across the United States. And one of the main facilitators in stifling this opposition to this murderous policy, teachers without vaccines being put into schools, one of the main spreaders of the vaccine, and it was the unions, the teachers' unions in the United States, that told them to hush up and helped the Biden administration, the Trump administration at the time, push it through. One example I can think of quite vividly is a teacher from Texas called Michael Hull, who gave a video interview with the WSWS, the American chapter, on his meeting. He had a meeting during which the head of the union, the head of the teachers union, Randy Weingarten, consistently interrupted him when he tried to raise the role of the unions in securing the reopenings of the schools.
Yeah, I think there's been interesting questions raised already with regard to the sort of arts being targeted. I think that's entirely right. I mean, I'd like to quote Tudge, who's the education minister, who said, who's making an appeal that academics become more like entrepreneurs, and that shows the framework in which they're working. It's very much a sort of a market-driven approach that they have, and the targets in this will be people involved in culture, and also people involved such as Frank, who are deemed to be amazing educators. It's not educators that are wanted. It's people who attract funds from industry along with this market orientation, and that's been a process that's been developing it hasn't happened straight away. It's been a process that's happened over decades, and it's been a bipartisan approach. The comment made on fees. Sorry, I forget. The chat's gone by, and I forget who made the comment about fees paid by students. Every international student knows the conception of a cash cow, and they can see that their role in that being played, very, very explicitly. One student that I spoke to a couple of days ago noted that his educational experience had been going downhill rapidly over the past year and a half, but he was still paying enormous fees to the university. So the whole conception of a cash cow is something that that you don't have to explain to any students, let alone the international students. It's something that they're entirely familiar with. Someone raised the issue of why Frank has been reinstated now. Look, we can't really we can conjecture, but we can't make any conclusions about that. But I think that the university, Macquarie University is extremely sensitive to the kinds of developments that have been initiated by the students and the support that can be won through this meeting, and are very sensitive towards an organised student and staff collaboration. So I think they are watching developments very carefully, and I think it is not a coincidence that there's been these moves made just two days ago. And on the issue of what's happening in the United States in particular, there was a major strike being undertaken by graduate students at Cornell University, who, for reasons that I don't quite understand, the union that represents them is the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union. And they sold out this graduate struggle. Many graduates in the United States work as TAs and use and fund their graduate studies through being employed by the university, and they've been paid essentially poverty level wages, and they were driven into a strike by by very wealthy universities such as Cornell, and like with the actual work with the Volvo workers who are so-called represented by the UAW, the UAW also sold out the graduate students at Cornell University, and that's representative of many other struggles all around the world as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. There's been a whole host of questions. It's a very lively discussion. I think Melissa was one who asked, what does this mean for the future of universities? Well, let me just make a couple of quick points about that. In addition to, the pro-corporate restructuring that we've all experienced already is now going to be taken to the nth degree. We have, of course, what the government calls the Jobs Ready package. That is, universities are to become nothing more than training grounds for vocational purposes to meet the requirements of big business. We also have a thing called micro-credentialing, 6-week courses. And I think at Newcastle University now they're going to change their semesters to 6-week blocks to go in that same direction. So universities which traditionally have become and have been and fought for by the working class to be places where young people can develop themselves intellectually, can acquire a knowledge of history and culture, and therefore can think critically, that has to be shut down at all costs. And as Frank has just put in the chat as well, another feature of the restructuring university is to make them increasingly integrated into the military apparatus, both in terms of research for the manufacturers of military weapons, and also in terms of integrating them into US backed finance research as well. I mean, this is all part of the drive towards, the danger of another world war, in this time by the United States to preserve its hegemony in a conflict with China. I think there was another question also about, yes, there's a suggestion that Evren could possibly speak on that. Evren has written quite a number of articles on the militarization of the universities. Evren, do you want to speak on that? Evren is the president of the IYSC Club at Melbourne University.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, to everyone who's spoken already. I mean, I think that the points that have been made have been really crucial. Just to speak a little bit on what's been raised in terms of the integration of the universities into the war drive. I mean, it is very much bound up with the issues that we're discussing here today in terms of cuts to courses, the corporatization of universities, and attempts to turn them into not places of learning and for the cultural enrichment of young people and young members of the working class, but into the training grounds for for corporations. I mean, this has been developing over a number of years now. We've written articles on the World Socialist website over the last 5 or so years on the fact that university after university is now linking up, signing deals with the largest defense contractors from around the world, worth millions, if not tens of millions of dollars around the country. I think every single public university now is signed up to what's known as the, I'm probably going to get the name wrong, but I think it's the Defense Science Program, the DSP, which basically is an agreement to seeking out and joining with these military contractors from the largest, like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, naval group in France, right through to others. And this is, as Mike alluded to, bound up with the growing war drive against China, which we've warned about over the past decade or so, which has really ramped up as the US is undergoing a historic decline in its position as the world superpower, seeing China as its main threat economically. It is building up its military forces in preparation for military conflict to shore up its position. So universities have historically played a central role in the war drive, in stifling anti-war sentiment, and in such partnerships with defense. So I think it is a really critical issue to see the link between the attacks on courses, the attacks on jobs, the attacks on education, and the broader drive towards war. It's a very important discussion, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Evram. There was a question earlier on. I mean, there's a whole host of questions. One question is from Frank, who's here, and he's very welcome, of course, in this discussion. How many rank and file committees do currently exist at various Australian universities? Well, the short answer is we're in the process of forming them, and we're in the process of forming a network of rank and file committees. The Committee for Public Education, which has been campaigning, for numbers of years and has been intervening very widely in meetings among academics and students now, is developing that fight. But we need to take it forward. We need to get in contact with academics and students, across more universities. We have embryos currently in numbers of universities where we have IYSSC clubs actively campaigning, but we need to develop this more. So we will show a slide at the end of the meeting, among others, which will be asking people to please sign up to join the rank and file committees and establish a network across the country that can take forward the very important fight that's been initiated that we're discussing at this meeting.
I'm happy to make a few points, Mike.
Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
In response to Christina's question in the Q&A, which I think is very relevant to what Mike's just comments on rank and files. Christina's question is, if you can't see it, how can students be helped to distinguish the false hopes given by pseudo-left parties at the unis and SEP in comparison? Well, and it's a good question because, the pseudo-left, they say, we need better education. We need, more respect to teachers and students alike. However, their method and perspective on how, significant changes can be achieved are, counter-revolutionary. They objectively oppose the interests of the working class. And, how students can help to distinguish these these false hopes. It's not by turning internally that you can find the answers to these difficult questions. How do you actually oppose capitalism? It's not as easy, as it may seem at face value. It's by turning to the revolutionary parties through rank and file committees, that is our entire perspective. It's to build a political perspective among students and staff, so you can distinguish who is the pseudo left, what the NTU is doing and why they're doing that.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Now, Mana has put her comment in the chat. I'll just read it out, and others might want to take up her contribution, her questions, her comments. She says, I think my opinion about the job cuts is just reinforced by the lack of support and assistance at the moment with the system of education. I believe it needs to be stricter, and student options and matters should be taken at greater significance. I think that some important issues raised there. I mean, the students don't get a voice in any of this. There's 1.5 million students currently enrolled in higher education. Their whole futures are being decimated by what's happening to their education and what's happening throughout the economy and public health as well. So maybe others want to take up that. And we've seen this by the way, just to make a point, if you read the comments on the petitions that we've reported on the World Socialist website, you see students are very thoughtful, very passionate, very horrified by what they see happening throughout our universities. They want to learn, they want to broaden their minds, they want to, take part in the development of, human knowledge, and this is being stripped away from them. They're being told you can't take a course. Courses are being shut down, except for those which have a direct, narrow reference to the requirements of the corporate elite. I think Evram, there's a comment here from Cobra. There's also a massive push at Macquarie Uni towards making the Bachelor of Arts degree more corporate friendly, and 2 core units specifically dedicated to building a portfolio for art students, which will appeal to major corporations and industry. Exactly. I mean, at Monash University as well, the academic who's being targeted there is an expert on art history and theory, just the very critical kinds of areas that are so crucial for humankind. I think Evram wanted to speak on that question.
Yeah, I'll just make a very brief point, Mike. I mean, I think that the issue of the effect that the course restructurings and the attacks on university workers and courses and so on more broadly, and in relationship to the student experience is actually an important one to dwell on. I mean, we spoke with a student from Monash University in writing the recent article on the sacking of the academic there, who said students are aware of what's going on. Students aren't blind to this. There are discussions on social media, in classrooms, etc., about what's taking place. And above all, students are saddened and worried because they are losing brilliant academic minds and impassioned educators. So this does have a real effect on students, their education, and that has provided, I think, the impulse for the campaigns that we're seeing today. In defense of Frank, in defense of Dr. Bryant at Monash, and this petition at UWA. This is the sort of beginnings, the impulsive response by students to what they're seeing around them, and to the degradation of their education. What we're seeking to do through this meeting today and through future discussions of the CFPE, the IYSSE, and the rank and file committees that we are building is to raise what the essential issues are, why this is taking place, and therefore how it can be fought. You can't see the attacks on education, whether it be in the higher education sector or in secondary schools or primary schools or wherever else. You can't see that as separate from the broader assault on the working class, again, which is bound up with the drive towards war, authoritarianism, and shoring up the profits of the wealthy. I mean, it's a very simple equation. If money is taken out of education, it's going somewhere, and you can bet your bottom dollar, quite literally, that it's going towards military spending. You know, Biden just announced the largest yearly budget for the US military, $753 billion US dollars. You have increased military spending in every imperialist country. And this is at the expense of education, also healthcare, social welfare, etc. So I think that, you know, what we're seeking to develop is a very broad movement, understanding the essential issues and the fact that behind all of these attacks is the capitalist profit system itself. And therefore what's required is a united movement of students, educators, and all workers internationally in opposition to this, and for the building of a socialist revolutionary movement.
Thanks, Evram. I think
so before Sue comes in, could I make a couple of quick points on the points that have already been, just to supplement some points that have already been made? I think with regard to the role of students, I think it is a really important point. We're actually the only organisations that is actually trying to incorporate the role of students and actually educate them. And that actually also goes to Christina's comment, which I'll come back to in a moment. But students, by and large, don't know what's going on because not really nobody except us tells them. When they don't know about staff cuts, they don't know about the conditions under which staff are working. I mean, there's the occasional student that knows, but it's really the exception that proves the rule. Students are really kept in the dark. And with regard to what's happening at universities and the future for education, it's really quite dire. The workloads imposed on academics are quite extraordinary. It's widely acknowledged that actually with the staff cuts that are being imposed, the work simply will not be able to get done under the current work models, and the already strenuous conditions in which academics are working are going to be ramped up even further. Students are having classes of 1,000 in tutorials that don't really exist, and they're getting feedback which is more or less non-existent. So the educational experience of the students is really dreadful. It's a disaster, and that's going to worsen. Now, I mean, Zach's already said that I think that Christina's question is really important. You know, she says, how can students be helped to distinguish the false hope given by the pseudo-left parties and at the universities and the SEP in comparison? The short answer to that is to explain to students the class difference between these organizations. The pseudo-left actually very frequently don't even put the name socialism up front. They hide behind, they don't say that, they don't even try to say that they're socialists, but to explain the class orientation of these organizations and explain the class orientation of our organization, to explain that we're fighting for the interest of the working class, and they're actually defending a sort of a wealthy layer of a wealthy layer. And that is manifested in many, many different ways. Their support for the unions that sell out the interest of workers, their support for war. They support US interventions in the Middle East. And so sort of that when you go through that exposure of these organizations, that opens up the eyes of students in this process. But they need to be, it's only us who is actually bringing forward this, bringing forward these class interests. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Just before Sue Phillips, who's the national convener of the Committee for Public Education, has indicated to speak. Just before I call on Sue, there's a comment in the chat from Michael Smith. He's a member of the IYSSC club at Griffith University. But he's a young worker, and of course, the IYSSC is open to young workers as well as to students. He just says, attacks on jobs and education has again exploded during this global pandemic. The aggressive, I think he means aggressive, attacks on universities extend more than a decade, which is the pursuit of endless profits rather than the pursuit of learning and knowledge. But the pandemic is further breaking apart the contradictions of the capital system as a whole. I certainly agree with that. Now, there was a question earlier from Shepparton, and maybe Sue would also like to address that, about the role of parents and grandparents, which is certainly an issue we could take up as well. But Sue, did you want to make some points? Can we unmute Sue? While Sue's sorting out, the question I referred to was from Colleen from Shepparton. She says, are you encouraging parents and grandparents to be included in your rank and file committees? Students and educators are supported in this fight by family who see firsthand the decimation of their children's education, both secondary and tertiary. There's a lot of anger out there as parents see their children channeled into local corporate need rather than following their dreams. This is epitomised in Greater Shepparton, Victoria, where we've been highlighting the fight of, the parents and students there against the so-called super school being established by the Andrews Labor government in Shepparton. Look, just before we take more questions, and look, it would really help me now if the TEG team could possibly post a summary of all the questions we haven't got to yet, because there's so many of them, which is very welcome. But just can we just take a look at the slides we have prepared on extra reading, extra literature, because it's very important, of course, for everyone taking part to develop their understanding of the issues at stake. There's two pamphlets on the screen at the moment, both available from Mehring Books, which is our online bookstore, mehring.com.au. One is The Education Battleground, The Market versus Social Equality by Linda Tannenbaum. And since this was written a quarter century ago, it's actually proven to be completely prescient in the warnings it was making about the corporate re-gearing, restructuring of education at every level. And the pamphlet explains the fundamental incompatibility between the market, the capitalist market, and a social equality and the requirements of genuine education. The other pamphlet on the screen from the Socialist Equality Party in the United States looks back over 30 years since the PATCO strike, the strike of the air traffic controllers in the United States, that was not just, well, it was crushed by the Reagan administration, but that was only possible because the air traffic controllers, like so many other sections of workers in America, were isolated by the AFL-CIO trade union bureaucracy. But that strike was, in a certain sense, a turning point in the suppression of the class struggle. We've written recently on the significance of the Volvo workers' struggle, that it, in many ways, brings to an end that period, that we now have a new resurgence, which is directly in rebellion against these union apparatuses and informed by, influenced by, led by rank and file committees in which our party is taking a leading role. We have one more slide, I think, on the literature. This is really important reading of a more historic and seminal kind by David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, on the Russian Revolution and the unfinished 20th century. Our analysis is that the 20th century, all the issues that were raised in the 20th century, including, economic breakdown, world wars, fascism, and above all, the inspiration given to the working class by the 1917 revolution, these issues remain still the issues of the epoch in which we remain. And this book provides an analysis of those underlying historical questions, and particularly, of course, draws upon the analysis of Leon Trotsky, the founder of the Fourth International. Leon Trotsky, the co-leader with Lenin of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and the leader of the fight against the Stalinist betrayal and degeneration of that revolution. Leon Trotsky's analysis sets out the nature of the epoch in which we're living and the necessity for world socialist revolution. So we certainly encourage people to dig deeper, develop their reading, start assembling a library of Marxist literature, and review the enormous list of other titles that are also available on mehring.com.au. Okay, let's turn back to the questions. To anybody else who wants to contribute. I think Sue is now online. Sue, do you want to unmute? And
yeah, I wanted to sort of address some of the issues that were raised about corporate restructuring. And firstly, before doing that, I think, I mean, you know, I'd firstly like to say we very much welcome the reappointment of Frank Macquarie. And as we've said in many of our statements, we see this as not just an individual issue, but it's just the beginning of a fight that needs to be taken forward to defend all academics, all educators' jobs. I mean, this process of eliminating educators such as Frank, clearly a dedicated, passionate, wonderful educator, that process of eliminating these people from education is a process that's not just confined to universities, but is really a process that is taking place, you know, right across the board from primary to secondary and tertiary. Some of the best and most experienced educators that are so valuable for a all-rounded education system are being driven out. They are being driven out through the imposition of this sort of corporate model, but also on the basis of bringing in a new layer, a younger layer of educators who are less experienced, are cheaper, and don't have the knowledge of the older workforce. In part of the chat before I sort of disappeared, I noticed Colleen raised some issues about Shepparton and the importance, you know, can parents and so on participate in rank and file committees? Absolutely. I mean, you know, the rank and file committees are open to anyone who wants to take forward a fight independent of the unions and the official political parties. And of course, the parents in Shepparton have played an absolutely critical role in opposition to the imposition of an education plan in Shepparton, which is creating a disaster. And it is driven by, in Shepparton, it's being imposed without proper consultation against the wishes of the students and parents and teachers, but it's being imposed and it's driven on by a sort of corporate model. And some of our readers and so on will have read about the situation in Shepparton with the imposition of the super school there, the closure of 4 secondary schools into one super school of about, and originally thought to be 2,700 kids. And it's just been in implementation over the last year and is already creating absolute disaster where teachers are leaving, students are leaving, all sorts of programs that were in existence that looked after the welfare of the kids, that were engaging for the kids and so on, have been eliminated. And one of the things that's being introduced and has been introduced, and this is a sort of model, the super school is a sort of public school model now being imposed under conditions where less and less funding is going to the public school system and more funding is going into the private schools, where the inequality in education in Australia is one of the greatest in the world. One of the curriculums or programs that's being implemented at the Shepparton Super School is a program by Bill Gates. Bill Gates, and more we're seeing the introduction of sort of edgy business into the schools, whether it's Pearson coming in, whether it's Google. All sorts of business are being brought in with programs that cost money, that make enormous profits for business, but they're a curriculum that is clearly very regressive. It's against the arts. It's against the development of critical thinkers. It's against, you know, engaging kids in an all-rounded way. And this whole process here began in Australia with the introduction by the Laborites this was before Rudd and Gillard brought in the Education Revolution and NAPLAN, but it was introduced by a Labor government, the state Labor government brought in the Boston Consulting Group. This is a business group that comes into companies to increase productivity, to drive up profit and so on. And so, you know, this process of corporatisation is I think Chris said in his contribution that it's a process of sort of social retrogression, what we're seeing in education, and that is being implemented, you know, under capitalism. I mean, more and more teachers in the public school system are tied to whatever the data or outcomes of the kids. We're seeing the removal of important programs, and this is the process because society, capitalist society, don't want kids, the vast majority of kids, to be critical about society. They want kids that can just, you know, agree to whatever, have the basics, 3 R's, and if necessary, be driven off to the next World War. And so, you know, this process is going on right across. And what has happened in Shepparton is a microcosm of the crisis that is taking place in public education overall. But there is resistance, and that's very clear, and it's expressed by people like Colleen, you know, who have stood up against this, are continuously fighting, but they have to fight as a part of a rank and file group, a network of rank and file groups, independent of Labor, the Nationals, whoever. It can't, and it's not a question of pressuring these organisations to do the right thing. What's becoming very, very clear in every situation, whether it's COVID or restructuring, the working class has to begin to fight completely independently. So I think that, Robin in Shepparton has really led this fight alongside Colleen, and they haven't given up. They've organised rallies and so on, but they must, you know, they should join the Committee for Public Education. We should take forward the fight of rank and file committees to join up with the other people that are opposing the super schools, like Murwillumbah, New South Wales, and so on. But that, you know, this restructuring is never ending, no matter what students think, teachers think, the governments are ploughing ahead, and workers have to develop their own independent response to this situation.
Okay, thanks, Sue. I just want to read out a comment from Robin, who Sue's just mentioned. It's in the chat. I know this is a meeting regarding university. In Shepparton, this is what is happening in our one secondary school that the Labor/independent government have forced on us. The elite in Shepparton get a say in our children's education than we do as parents. I think she means more than we do as parents. They are streamlining students into what they want them to do, not what the students actually want. The AEU, that's the Australian Education Union, the teachers' union, has been useless and continue to support the government, not the teachers. Teachers have been gagged and cannot speak out publicly. We have lost so many good teachers, with more that will be let go as this new school year opens up next year. Thanks for that, Robin. Now, I think Carolyn Kennett wants to speak. Carolyn is another maths educator from Macquarie University and also a long-standing member of the CFPE and of the SEP. Carolyn, go ahead.
Thanks. Actually, it's really good that you just read out that comment from Robin, because I was going to sort of raise some of those things as well. I think, you know, one of the things that has been said a number of times and has also been referred to in the chat is the impact of this corporatization of education from you know, primary through to tertiary education, the impact that that has on students and their dreams of what they want to learn. And I mean, I think, you know, the students at Macquarie University who started this petition that we were partly discussing, and like the students at other universities that have started petitions, recognise that what's actually being what the huge cost to their education, because, you know, that very, very fine lecturers are like Frank are being targeted, but in fact, and broad disciplines. Cobra raised some discipline things, and Mane as well. And I think that you know, that this corporatization and this push and this drive to have universities and schools really focusing on narrowing the curriculum and only teaching what serves the needs of big business is so detrimental to students' education. And I think students recognise that. And I think that that was probably part of the reason why they wanted to fight, and they do want to fight. And, you know, that impacts on mathematics as well. Universities are pushing more and more and more to only keep disciplines where they draw in many students that are working, you know, going to be working for industry, or where they can bring in large amounts of money from industry collaboration. And so mathematics is also a creative discipline, and the students who signed the petition recognise that their mathematics education was outstanding, and that they were prepared to fight for not just themselves but for future students, you know, who deserve to have a high quality education. So I think it's detrimental to the nation as well. That is true, but you know, students recognise that they are being, even though universities have these lip service to students first, actually what's happening around in schools and in universities is that students are getting a less quality education. They're spending less time with their lecturers, and they're being diverted into courses that are really designed to meet the needs of corporate Australia. Thanks for letting me speak.
Okay, look, there's an important other question from Colleen in Shepparton. She asked, do parents and grandparents, carers need to form their own rank and file committee to join with you, or is it better to join an existing rank and file committee? Well, that's a very good question, and that turns us to the issue of the building of these rank and file committees. And the short answer is, get in touch with us, and we'll discuss how we can develop this. We need to develop a whole network, which may include various different schools, different campuses, different sectors. But let's get in touch everyone, and we can discuss how we take this this forward. There's another comment from Melissa as well. She says, educators such as Frank are now classed as dead wood, but when now more than ever, we really need educators with these knowledges, not to be dismissing them at such a pertinent time in our nation's history. I would just perhaps say it's not just about, of course, the nation, so-called, of Australia, but the world, the globe. I mean, we're clearly at a crisis point in human civilization, threatened by the pandemic, threatened by the response of the capitalist governments, threatened by the danger of war, climate catastrophe, and ever-growing social deprivation and inequality. But that's why we need the education of young minds, and that's why the ruling class is so desperate to prevent this. Now, we are starting to, getting to the point where we'll need to start drawing the discussion to a close. Let me just raise the fund now, and then we can come back to take any last contributions, questions. I know there's a lot of questions we haven't still got to, but we will make a point of getting back to everybody who's contributed to the discussion, and we'll certainly clarify the points that have been raised. But we do urge you all, please, to support this work, both in your own activity, but also financially. The Socialist Equality Party, which is sponsoring both the IYSSC and the Committee for Public Education, and leading the fight for rank and file committees, and the World Socialist website itself, we can only sustain ourselves and develop our work and expand our work, which is so urgently necessary now, on the basis of the financial support that we get from ordinary working class people, young and old, who support our movement. We don't get any funds, of course, from the corporate elite. We don't get any government sponsorship, and we wouldn't accept it even if it was offered, of course. Now, any other comments before we close up, before we end up the discussion today? Any final points or questions that people want to raise? There's some wonderful comments still in the chat we haven't even got to yet. There's Kerry, who's only sent it to panelists, but she says, I recently attended a play at my local theatre, which descended into fatalism. It is the second such production in a number of years with the same trajectory. Our reactionary position would be to be indifferent to these cuts and developments because of the influence of postmodernist thought. Yes, we don't accept any of this. We insist on fighting back, and the working class is the social force which can and will take up this fight. So this is how you can contact us and join. Contact the CFP, first of all, the Committee for Public Education, either on Facebook or on Twitter or by email. We encourage you to, whether you're a teacher, parents, students, to get in touch, get involved, join the committee, and help us establish the network of rank and file committees that we need to establish, we need to develop. For students and young people, young workers included, this is how you can contact the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, either by Facebook or Twitter or via email. And again, we need to establish IYSSC clubs and chapters, across not just university campuses, but also more broadly. And we're get in touch and join up for that. And finally, how to join our party, the Socialist Equality Party. We are the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the movement established by Leon Trotsky, the co-leader of the Russian Revolution, to fight the betrayals of Stalinism and to resolve the crisis of leadership, of working class leadership, produced by the Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet Union. This is our statement of principles on the screen. It's available also from mehring.com.au. It's $5. You can also access it via the World Socialist website. We urge you to read the statement of principles. If you agree with it, then you should join our party. You can also get in touch with us on Facebook or Twitter or via email. And, let me just say this, it's up to all of us. Every one of us has to make decisions about what lies ahead. The sentiments expressed in this meeting today are a very powerful expression of what we need, but it'll require a party to lead the working class in this struggle. Now, sorry, I've just been reminded, we also have one more slide to show about an upcoming event. The IYSSE is holding a major national online meeting on August the 14th, also at 4 p.m, called COVID Chaos, Job and Wage Cuts, War Dangers, the Crisis of Capitalism and the Resurgence of the Working Class. And of course, that's a photograph of the workers on the picket line at the Volvo plant in Virginia. So please join the IYSSE for that meeting. Are there any other last comments or questions before we end the discussion? There's a question from Melissa. Can we share this on our own social media? Yes, of course, please. Help us to spread the word as widely as possible on social media. Most of us are now in lockdown, so, but at any time, of course, social media is very important. I think, Zach, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I just want to make some closing points to everyone and thank everyone for attending. Now, Frank's reinstatement, this is not a victory. It's something that should not have happened in the first place. A real victory, for the working class, for the staff and educators, would be the reinstatement of the 90,000 jobs that were lost last year, just in Australia, and then the 650,000 lost in America. And the reason why we raise international precedents is because they are exactly that. The diminishing of wages for ports workers in southern France sets a precedence, for the conditions for workers here. And this is across all industries. And so this requires an international movement. And so thank you everybody for attending and help us build the rank and files.
Thanks, Zach. There's a note there from Frank. Thanks all for the SEP perspective on things. I agree with Zach, it's not a victory at all. Well, thank you, Frank, and let's have more discussion then with Frank and everybody else about how we take forward this initiative, begun by the students, taken up by our movement, and let's deepen it and extend it. Okay, thank you all very much for your participation and contribution. I'm sorry, I apologize for the fact that I know there are questions that we have not gotten to. They came in a rush. We will get back to everybody with the questions and we'll develop the discussion. Okay, thank you very much again, and we'll finish up there.